Healing isn't linear. Why you keep circling back to the same wound you thought you were done with this? You really did. That wound you spent years working through, that pattern you swore you'd broken, that part of yourself you believed you'd finally healed. And then one morning you wake up and there it is again, the same ache, the same reaction, the same gravitational pull toward the very thing you thought you'd transcended. And in that moment, a devastating question arrives. Have I learned nothing? Am I right back where I started? Here's what makes this so painful. It's not just the return of the wound itself. It's the story you tell yourself about what this return means. That you've failed, that healing was an illusion, that you're fundamentally broken in some way that can't be fixed. You look at the spiral of your life and see only a circle, a cosmic joke, proof that transformation is just another beautiful lie we tell ourselves to make the struggle bearable. But what if everything you believe about healing is wrong? What if the return to the wound isn't regression, but recognition? What if you're not going in circles but ascending a spiral, passing the same point at a higher elevation each time, seeing it from a perspective you couldn't have accessed before? What if the wound that keeps calling you back is not your failure but your teacher, and every return is not evidence of stagnation, but an invitation to a deeper layer of truth? Let me tell you about Sarah. She's 37 years old, and for the past 15 years, she's been working on her relationship with her mother. Therapy, journals, boundary, setting workshops, healing retreats, books stacked on her nightstand, and promising liberation. And it worked. She could feel it working. The charge around those childhood memories began to fade. She stopped needing her mother's approval quite so desperately. She built a life that felt authentically hers. Then one afternoon, her mother makes an offhand comment, something small, practically nothing, a slight about Sarah's parenting style, delivered with that particular smile Sarah knows so well. And suddenly, she's 12 years old again. The defensiveness rises like a tide. The old wound splits open with surgical precision. That night, Sarah sits in her car in her driveway, crying with a specific quality of despair reserved for those who believed they were beyond this. I'm still not free, she thinks. After everything, I'm still not free. This is the great disillusionment of the healing journey. We enter it with a linear map. Identify the problem, do the work, achieve the breakthrough, move forward healed. It's the hero's journey we've been sold. You descend into the darkness, you face the dragon, you retrieve the treasure, you return transformed. End of story, roll credits. But real healing doesn't follow narrative conventions. It doesn't respect our timelines or our investments. You can spend years in therapy, have profound realizations, experience genuine transformation, and then find yourself triggered by the same wound that started the whole journey. And this return feels like betrayal. It violates the unspoken contract we believed we had with our own consciousness. If I do the work, I get to be done. Consider Michael, who thought he'd healed his abandonment wounds until his partner needed space, and suddenly he's that terrified child again, clinging and pushing simultaneously. Or Janet, who processed her perfectionism through years of self-compassion practice, only to find herself at 3 in the morning obsessively revising an email for the 40th time, chasing an impossible standard of flawlessness. What's happening here? Why does healing refuse to be linear? Why do we return, again and again, to the same psychological territory we thought we'd mapped and moved beyond? The conventional wisdom offers several explanations, and they're all partly true. You haven't done deep enough work, says one voice. You need to try a different modality, suggests another. Maybe you're addicted to your suffering, whispers a third, cruelly. Perhaps healing is about managing symptoms rather than achieving cure. Offers the pragmatic perspective. You're supposed to forgive and let go. Insists the spiritual bypass, but none of these explanations capture the full truth. They all assume that the return to the wound is a problem to be solved, a failure to be corrected. They all position you as someone who's doing healing wrong. Here's what they miss. The wound that keeps calling you back is not your enemy. It's the guardian of something you haven't yet retrieved. And each return is not regression. It's a deepening. You're not failing to heal. You're learning that healing is not what you thought it was. Think of the way a spiral staircase works. As you climb, you pass the same spatial coordinates repeatedly, but each time you're higher. From above, someone might say, you're back where you started. But you know differently. You can see further now. The view has expanded. The context has shifted. This is the paradox at the heart of psychological healing. You must return to the wound precisely because you have grown. The wound doesn't shrink. You expand, and in expanding, you develop the capacity to meet the wound at deeper and deeper levels, to retrieve meaning from it that you couldn't have accessed before. But our culture hates this truth. We live in a world that worships linear progress, that measures success in forward motion, that pathologizes circles and spirals as signs of stuckness. We're taught that healing should look like climbing a mountain. Start at the bottom, reach the top, plant your flag, done. The idea that you might need to descend the same mountain multiple times, each descent revealing new caves and crevices you couldn't see before, feels like failure. So we shame ourselves. We compare our spirals to other people's apparent straight lines. We wonder what's wrong with us, that we can't just heal and move on. And in this shame, we miss the profound intelligence of the psyche that keeps bringing us back to the same wound, insisting that there's something here we need to see, something we're not yet ready to understand, something that can only be revealed through return and recognition. Carl Jung understood something that most of modern psychology still hasn't fully grasped. The psyche doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in mandalas, in spirals, in circular processes that return to the same center from ever widening perspectives. What looks like regression is often circumambulation, the psychological circling of a sacred center, approaching truth from multiple angles because truth of this magnitude can't be apprehended all at once. Jung called this process individuation, and he was very clear that it wasn't a neat, tidy journey. It was messy, cyclical, often painful, and it required you to return again and again to the same psychological material, each time with greater consciousness, greater capacity, greater willingness to see what you couldn't see before. The psyche, Jung wrote, is not a point but a circumference. You are not a fixed self trying to fix a broken part. You are a vast, dynamic system that contains multitudes, and healing is not about elimination but integration. It's about expanding your circumference to include what you've been excluding, to hold what you've been rejecting, to bring into consciousness what has been living in the dark. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes essential. The shadow is not just the bad things about yourself that you've repressed. It's everything you've disowned in order to maintain a particular self-image. It's the unlived life, the unexpressed potential, the rejected aspects of your being that don't fit the story you've constructed about who you are. And here's the crucial insight. The wound that keeps returning is often the threshold to your shadow. It's the place where you keep meeting disowned aspects of yourself. This is why you can't simply let it go or move past it. The wound is not an obstacle to your wholeness. It's a portal to it. Consider Sarah again, returning to that familiar wound with her mother. On the surface, it looks like she hasn't healed her need for maternal approval. But what if something else is happening? What if each return to this wound is giving her access to a different layer of her shadow? The first time she worked with this wound, she might have retrieved her anger, the part of herself that was allowed to say no, to have boundaries, to recognize mistreatment. That was genuine healing, but the wound remained because there were deeper layers. The second return might have revealed her grief, the mourning for the mother she never had, the childhood she deserved but didn't receive. Another layer, another retrieval, real progress. But now, in this third or fourth or 10th return, the wound might be asking her to meet something even more uncomfortable, her identification with her mother, the ways she's internalized her mother's voice, the places where she treats herself exactly as her mother treated her. This is shadow work at its most confronting, and it can only be accessed by returning to the original wound with greater consciousness. Jung understood that the psyche compensates. When you push something away, it pushes back. When you declare yourself healed of something, the unconscious says, "Oh, really? Let's check." And it sends you right back to the wound, not to torture you, but to see if you've truly integrated the lesson or if you've just bypassed it, painted over it, spiritualized it away. This is why Jung was so skeptical of premature claims of transformation. He'd seen too many people have powerful breakthroughs that lasted exactly until the next time their complex got activated. A complex, in Jungian terms, is a cluster of emotionally charged thoughts, feelings, and memories that act like an autonomous subpersonality. You don't have a complex, the complex has you. And when it gets triggered, it temporarily takes over your entire psychological system. Your recurring wound is often the location of your most powerful complex, and healing that complex doesn't mean eliminating it. It means developing a conscious relationship with it. It means learning to notice when the complex is activated, to observe its patterns without being completely identified with them, to expand your consciousness enough to hold both the complex and awareness that you are not reducible to the complex. This takes time. It takes repetition. It takes returning to the same psychological territory again and again, each time with slightly more awareness, slightly more capacity, slightly more ability to stay present with what's uncomfortable. Jung called this the process of integration. And integration is fundamentally different from transcendence. Transcendence says, "I'm going to rise above this wound." Integration says, "I'm going to include this wound in a larger understanding of who I am." The persona, the social mask you wear, wants transcendence. It wants to be seen as healed, whole, beyond such petty struggles. But the self, Jung's term for the totality of your being, both conscious and unconscious, knows that wholeness comes through integration, not elimination. This is why the individuation process often involves what Jung called an antiodromia, the transformation into the opposite. You can't integrate what you've been rejecting until you're willing to meet it, to become it, to discover that the thing you've been running from contains exactly what you've been searching for. The wound you keep returning to is asking you to integrate something, not to fix something, not to transcend something, to integrate it, to bring it into the wholeness of your being. And this integration happens in layers, in spirals, in recursive returns that feel like regression until you realize they're actually progression toward a wholeness you couldn't have imagined when you started. Jung knew that this process couldn't be rushed. The privilege of a lifetime, he wrote, is to become who you truly are, not who you think you should be, not who you've decided you are, who you truly are in all your contradictory, paradoxical, irreducible complexity. And that requires returning to the wound again and again, until you're no longer trying to heal it but learning from it, until you're no longer at war with this part of yourself, but in dialogue with it, until the wound transforms from enemy to teacher, from obstacle to portal. The philosophers have been circling this truth for millennia, though they've called it by different names. Nietzsche understood it as eternal return, the idea that you will live this life again and again, infinitely. But he didn't mean this as torture. He meant it as a test. Can you love your life enough to want it repeated eternally, wounds and all? Can you say yes to the return? What if some day or night? Nietzsche wrote, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? This is not about literal reincarnation. It's about your relationship with repetition, with return, with the cyclical nature of existence. The person who curses at the prospect of return is still at war with their life, still believing that healing means escaping the wound. The person who can say yes to eternal return has achieved something else entirely. Amor fati, the love of fate, the embrace of what is. But this embrace is not passive acceptance. It's not resignation. It's a profound shift in consciousness that can only come through repeated return to the same existential territory. You don't learn to love your fate by avoiding it. You learn to love it by meeting it again and again until you begin to see its hidden necessity, its terrible beauty, its role in making you who you are. Kierkegaard approached this from a different angle, but he arrived at a similar truth. He wrote about the necessity of repetition in the life of consciousness, arguing that genuine existence requires us to return to the same questions, the same struggles, the same anxious uncertainties, each time at a deeper level of subjectivity. For Kierkegaard, the opposite of despair is not hope. It's being willing to be yourself. And being yourself requires constant repetition of the choice to exist authentically rather than hiding in the comfortable roles society provides. You don't choose authenticity once and you're done. You choose it again and again, and each choice is a return to the same existential wound. The terror of being a finite creature making choices in an infinite universe, bearing responsibility for self you didn't ask to have. Eastern philosophy offers yet another lens. In Buddhist thought, samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, is often misunderstood as something to escape. But the deeper teaching suggests that samsara and nirvana are not two different places. They're two different relationships with the same reality. You don't escape the cycle, you transform your understanding of what the cycle means. The Tibetan practice of Bardo teachings makes this explicit. The Bardos are the transitional states between death and rebirth, but they're also understood as psychological states you pass through daily, hourly, moment by moment. You're constantly dying and being reborn, constantly returning to the same patterns, and the question is not whether you'll return, but whether you'll return with consciousness or unconsciousness, with resistance or recognition. This is where Western and Eastern wisdom converge with Jungian psychology. All three traditions recognize that human consciousness evolves through repetition and return, not through linear progress. The spiral is not a bug in the system, it's the system. Heidegger wrote about thrownness, the fact that we're thrown into existence without choosing it, and we must make meaning from this unchosen situation. And part of that thrownness is being thrown again and again into the same psychological situations, the same wounds, the same challenges. We don't choose our neuroses, we find ourselves with them, and the question becomes not, how do I escape this, but how do I authentically exist within this? This is a radical reframing of the healing project. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me that I keep returning to this wound?" you begin asking, "What is this wound trying to teach me that I can only learn through return?" The Stoics understood something similar. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. And one of our most painful judgments is the belief that we shouldn't have to face the same challenge twice. We believe that if we learn the lesson once, the test should be over. But life is not a school you graduate from. It's a practice you return to daily, with whatever consciousness you can muster. Marcus Aurelius, in his private journals, repeatedly reminds himself of the same truths, the same principles, the same ways of seeing. He's not failing to remember. He's recognizing that wisdom requires repetition, that consciousness is not a destination but a practice, that you must return again and again to the same insights because the mind constantly forgets, the ego constantly reasserts itself, the old patterns constantly resurface. This is not weakness. This is the human condition, and the sooner you stop fighting the return, the sooner you can begin learning from it. Even in mystical traditions, the path to enlightenment is described as a spiral. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote about the wound being the place where the light enters you. But this isn't a one-time event. The light enters through the wound repeatedly, each time illuminating something new, revealing a deeper layer of truth. The Christian mystics spoke of the dark night of the soul, but they understood that the dark night doesn't happen once. It returns. Each time you reach a new level of consciousness, a new dark night arrives to strip away the identifications you've formed at that level. The wound is the entrance to the mystery, and the mystery has infinite depth. What all these philosophical and spiritual traditions recognize is that the return to the wound is not pathology. It's ontology. It's the basic structure of how consciousness deepens, how meaning unfolds, how transformation actually occurs in a being that is both finite and infinite, both temporal and eternal, both broken and whole. The wound that keeps returning is not evidence that you're doing life wrong. It's evidence that you're alive, that you're conscious enough to recognize the pattern, that you're courageous enough to keep showing up for the most difficult work, the work of becoming who you truly are. So what does this actually look like in practice? How do you work with the return to the wound when you're in the middle of it, when every cell in your body is screaming that this is failure, that you should be beyond this by now? First, you notice the story you're telling yourself about the return. This might be the most important practice of all. When the wound resurfaces, your immediate interpretation is usually some version of "I'm back to square one. I haven't healed. I've failed." This story is not true, but it feels true, and it has enormous power to demoralize and destabilize you. The practice is to catch this story and question it, not to replace it with toxic positivity. Everything happens for a reason, this is a blessing, but to simply notice that you're telling a story, and stories are interpretations, and interpretations can be examined. You might ask yourself, what if this return is not regression? What if I'm meeting this wound from a different mental level? What am I noticing now that I couldn't notice before? These questions shift you from shame to curiosity, from judgment to investigation. Second, you map the spiral. This is a practice of recognition. You literally track the returns to see what's different each time. When Sarah returns to her wound with her mother, she can ask, "What did I learn the last time I was here? What was I able to see then that I couldn't see before? And what am I seeing now that's new?" Often, you'll discover that each return reveals a deeper layer. The first time through, you might see the behavior. The second time, you might see the belief beneath the behavior. The third time, you might see the need beneath the belief. The fourth time, you might see the identity structure beneath the need. Each layer requires a return because you couldn't have perceived that layer until you'd integrated the previous one. Third, you develop a relationship with the wound rather than trying to eliminate it. This is subtle but crucial. When you're trying to heal something, you're in opposition to it. You're trying to make it go away. But when you're in relationship with something, you're curious about it. You're listening to it. You're asking what it needs, what it's protecting, what it's trying to tell you. This shows up in your inner dialogue. Instead of "not this again," "what's wrong with me?" you begin to say, "Oh, you're back. What are you trying to show me this time?" It's a shift from hostility to hospitality, from rejection to reception. You might notice this shift beginning to happen when you can stay present with the wound instead of immediately trying to fix it or escape it. When Michael feels his abandonment wound activate, instead of immediately clinging or pushing away, he might pause and simply say, "This is abandonment fear. It's familiar. I know this territory." That recognition creates space, and in that space, consciousness can enter. Fourth, you honor the time healing takes. Our culture's obsession with productivity and efficiency has infected our approach to psychological work. We want to heal fast, move on quickly, optimize our transformation. But the psyche doesn't care about your timeline. It has its own rhythm, its own necessity, its own wisdom about what needs to happen when. When you keep returning to the same wound, it might be because you're trying to rush something that requires years, even decades, to fully integrate. The wound isn't resistant, you're impatient, and that impatience is itself often a defense against feeling the full depth of what the wound is asking you to feel. This means you have to make peace with the long game. You have to trust that the return is not random, not punishment, but part of an intelligent process that you don't fully control and don't need to understand completely in order to participate in. The practical markers of this shift are subtle but unmistakable. You might notice that even though you're returning to the same wound, you're less identified with it. It still hurts, but you're not as convinced that you are the wound. You can observe it arising without believing that this arising defines your entire being. You might notice that you recover more quickly. The wound might knock you down, but you don't stay down as long. You have more resources, more perspective, more ability to contextualize what's happening. You might notice moments of choice that didn't exist before. In the past, the wound would trigger an automatic reaction. Now, even though the trigger still fires, you have a moment, maybe just a second, where you can choose a different response. That moment is gold. That's where freedom lives. And it only comes through repeated return, through familiarizing yourself with the pattern so thoroughly that you begin to see the microseconds of space where agency exists. You might also notice a strange kind of gratitude beginning to emerge. Not for the wound itself, necessarily, but for what the wound has taught you, for the depth it's forced you to access, for the compassion it's developed in you, for the parts of yourself you've retrieved through being willing to return. This is when you know the relationship with the wound is transforming. When you can meet it with something approaching tenderness, even love. When you recognize it as the difficult teacher it is, the one who keeps showing up precisely because there's something in you that's ready to learn. The transformation that comes from embracing the spiral rather than fighting it is not what you expect. It's not that you finally heal the wound and it never returns. It's that you develop a completely different relationship with the return itself. You begin to see the wound not as a problem to be solved, but as a portal to be entered. Each return becomes an opportunity rather than a setback, an invitation rather than a condemnation. The wound stops being your enemy and becomes your teacher, your guide, your strange companion on the journey toward wholeness. This shift is paradoxical. You don't heal by making the wound go away. You heal by becoming large enough to contain it, spacious enough to hold it without being overwhelmed by it, conscious enough to learn from it without being defined by it. What emerges is a kind of sacred relationship with your own depths. You learn to trust the intelligence of your psyche even when, especially when, that intelligence brings you back to uncomfortable territory. You learn that the psyche knows what it's doing, that it has its own timing, its own curriculum, its own way of teaching you what you need to know. The integrated person is not someone without wounds. They're someone who has learned to work with their wounds, to extract meaning from them, to allow the wounds to shape them without destroying them. They've learned that wholeness doesn't mean perfection. It means inclusivity. It means having the capacity to hold all of yourself, the wounded parts, the shadow parts, the parts that don't fit your preferred image, with compassion and consciousness. This is what Jung meant by the self, not the ego that wants to be healed and done, but the self that includes both the wound and the healing, both the darkness and the light, both the breaking and the becoming. The self that is large enough to contain all the paradoxes, all the contradictions, all the returns. When you reach this understanding, the return to the wound doesn't devastate you anymore. It might still hurt. You might still struggle, but underneath the struggle there's a deeper knowing. This is part of my path. This return has meaning. Something is trying to emerge, and I have the capacity to meet it. You begin to live from the spiral rather than from the line. You stop measuring your progress by how far you've moved forward and start measuring it by how much deeper you've gone. You stop comparing your journey to anyone else's because you realize that your wound, with all its returns and revelations, is uniquely yours. It's shaping you into someone only you can become. The courage this requires cannot be overstated. To keep showing up for the same wound, to keep doing the work even when it feels endless, to keep trusting the process even when every linear part of your mind says you should be done by now. This is heroic in the truest sense, and slowly, something miraculous happens. The wound that once defined your suffering begins to define your wisdom. The place where you were most broken becomes the place from which you're most able to help others. The wound becomes the source of your deepest compassion, your hardest won insights, your most authentic power. This is the mystery of the wounded healer. Your wounds don't disqualify you from wholeness. They're the very path to it. And every return to the wound is an opportunity to deepen that path, to walk it more consciously, to discover layers of meaning you couldn't have accessed any other way. Remember Sarah, sitting in her car, devastated by the return of her wound. Imagine her 1 year later, sitting in the same car, triggered by another comment from her mother. But this time, something is different. She still feels the old pain, but she also feels herself feeling it. She notices the familiar patterns arising, and she recognizes them. "Hello," she says quietly to the wound. "I know you. I've been here before. What are you trying to teach me this time?" She doesn't have the answer yet. She might not have it for months or years, but she's asking the question. And in asking, she's transformed the return from regression into recognition, from failure into curriculum, from enemy into teacher. This is healing, not the absence of the wound, but the presence of consciousness with the wound. Not transcendence, but integration. Not the end of the journey, but the deepening of it. You are not failing because you keep returning to the same wound. You are succeeding in ways you can't yet measure. You are descending into depths that most people are too afraid to explore. You are doing the work that matters most, the work of becoming whole, which is always, always a spiral. The wound that keeps calling you back is not your shame, it's your teacher, it's your portal. It's the place where your consciousness is invited to expand, where your capacity is being forged, where the person you're becoming is learning to hold more truth, more complexity, more of the paradoxical fullness of being human. So the next time you find yourself back at the familiar wound, devastated by the return, pause. Take a breath and consider the possibility that you're not going backward. You're going deeper. You're not failing to heal. You're learning what healing actually means. And what it means is this: a willingness to return again and again to the places that hurt, armed with nothing but your growing consciousness, your expanding capacity, and your stubborn, sacred commitment to becoming whole. The spiral continues, the wound remains, and you are becoming someone who can hold both with grace.